It's my great pleasure to introduce our panellists for this session. We've got Dr. Kerry Schott, who will be well known to many of you, Annabel Crookes, Seved and Tim Reardon. As I said previously, all their information on their backgrounds and bios is on the app, so please have a look at that. It's now till lunch, so we're going to whip through some really high-level and important issues. Lots of interesting conversations that have already started today, I think, that go right to the heart of the topic here, which is around managing risk in major project delivery. My first question is perhaps a little bit of a leading one, which goes to how we can get the sector working with government at a level of maturity where contracts are awarded based on long-term value, and we heard a bit from Asfar about how you think about long-term value, rather than lowest price. Now, I guess there's a presumption in there that at the moment contracts are being awarded on the basis of price, but how is that working, and how can we get a broader focus on the sorts of value that Asfar was talking about, for instance? And Tim, I'm going to bring you in from the start. You're way down there, so I'll start with you, if that's all right.
No problem. Thanks, Melinda, and thanks for having us today. Appreciate it. I've sort of worked with government side, client side with projects for a long time, and I've seen that change over time. And I suppose the first thing I'd want to acknowledge is a decade ago, if we had the risks and challenges that were placed in front of us now with skills shortages, with supply chain disruption, the energy transition we're going through and inflation, we would not be able to deliver what we do now. And I think it's worth acknowledging that the maturity of both client side in governments around the country and procuring agencies, and certainly the construction community itself has moved a mountain over a 10-year period, and I think that's been a fantastic growth period across all of our urban areas. To your question specifically though, yes, government clients have to think about delivering value for money on behalf of taxpayers. That leads to a certain media and political dimension to it, where procuring agencies have to look at costs, without a doubt. But I mentioned the 10 years because there's been a lot of change in mindset over that period. Nothing's perfect, but more and more we hear out of the UK about outcomes-based contracting, value creation, and just doing things differently, because you can't waste a crisis, and COVID was a crisis. And after that crisis, we've realised that for all of the best laid risk mitigation, governance, risk and assurance that we can put in place, none of it proved correct. We didn't anticipate the external shock that would be COVID. We didn't anticipate the external shock that is now inflation and interest rate rises. So I think there's been good positive moves away from just lowest cost. I'm sure some of my fellow panel members will challenge that, but there is a mindset and a culture that is evolving. I wouldn't say it's perfect yet, but certainly evolving.
Who else wants to jump in on that? Annabel, do you think it's evolving? Is it evolving fast enough?
Not fast enough. I think there's still a propensity to choose on lowest cost, and I think the model and the procurement models that are set up by the states actually preclude better decisions. What we've seen, we work with the Construction Industry Leadership Task Force, which is a collaboration between New South Wales Government, Victorian Government and the ACA, and we've really looked at the fact that the definition of value itself is actually inhibiting government's ability to choose on anything other than lowest price. So this piece of work looked at how do you take the concept of value in a much broader sense and look at things like sustainability outcomes, whole of life outcomes. So I think there is absolutely good work happening to try and enable clients to make decisions in a different way, but I think historically the procurement models are still in a fairly traditional sense, picking on lowest price, unfortunately.
Seved?
Yeah, perhaps following up on what you just said, Annabel, is sustainability, yes, decarbonisation with the objectives we all have should be part of the assessment and not only the price, because otherwise we are unlikely to achieve our common objectives and goals in decarbonisation. I'd like to say that for us, what matters is the final cost, the outturn cost of a project, not the bid cost. And because especially when we talk about collaborative contract models where the pain is shared, for instance, or the gain is shared. And so it's all about the reliability of the value engineering, the methods and the program. Because as contractors, 90% of our costs are time related, more or less. So if we can't hold up to the program, then the losses are big, and for not only for us, but for the entire supply chain, subcontractors, and that's not sustainable. So the reliability of the program that is put forward at tender is essential for the project to be viable.
Kerry, did you want to weigh in on this?
I'd just make the comment that I think the experience across the public sector is a bit more mixed. There are some very cooperative contracting models that go on, but they do depend on the public sector as a contractor, or whatever part of it is doing the contracting, knowing a whole lot about the type of project and how to manage it, and basically being a very well-informed client, if you like. There are parts of the public sector where alliance-type contracts have worked very well for years and years because the client's very well-informed, and because you actually haven't got any hope of setting the price of the contract before you start. And such things as quite large, complex projects like doing up very old sewer lines, you have no idea what the scope of work is until you actually drain the pipe and get in there and look at it. And this is a cooperative exercise. So there are situations where contractors and government have learnt to work together very cooperatively, and those sorts of contracts have to work well. And I think with the more complex infrastructure that we're now seeing, everybody on both sides, but particularly in government, is learning much more, and that will help a great deal with more cooperative contracting going forward.
Well, let me carry on that conversation and the points you're making, because it relates to something that was raised in the previous discussion, I think, which is around culture and the nature of the relationship. And I'm interested to understand a little bit more about how you get to a place where there is a maturity of appreciation, if you like, that with these these larger projects with more complexity, with broader dimensions of value, how do you get to a place where you do get genuine alliance, genuine collaboration, and a sharing of that risk, if you like? Because there's tendencies to, want to think about this. I mean, I know in some of the public-private partnerships language that, you're offloading risk, and that's just so hard to do in these complex projects. So what do you think the critical dimensions are, Kerry, of getting to a better place on all of that?
Well, you mentioned risk. I think, first of all, contracting never starts with both sides hating each other. It often ends up that way, but it didn't ever start that way. So if it goes bad somewhere along the line, it's for a reason. And often it's because risk has been allocated to a party, usually the contractor, who was not in a position to bear it, but who's accepted it because otherwise they weren't going to be awarded the tender. And I think I would hope that government has learned not to pass risks across to people parties who really can't bear them, and shouldn't be bearing them. And I've seen recent examples of risk of interest rate and inflation being passed across to a contractor, which is completely mad. So, contractors know how to build things and are always happy to take those risks, but be careful about passing any other things across the table. And if you're willing to do that, you will pay severely for it.
Tim, do you want to provide some thoughts on that issue too, around the distribution of risk and to Kerry's point, how that's, I mean, often sits at the heart of the quality of the relationship, if you like, and how relationships can end up not being where they ought?
Sure. Look, I completely agree with what Kerry's just said then, and sort of to add on to that, the public services around the country, as I said at the start, are learning more and more about what can be allocated. Yes, they've allocated some risks to private sector in the past, and they've been proven wrong. You can never outsource political risk. It always comes back home. Always comes back home. So when you have a mega project, particularly in an urban area, you might feel good about brawling away with your contractor, but the media is only pointing in one direction about who actually owns that risk. So the reality is, as I said, sort of post-COVID, with the supply chain disruptions, with inflation right now, they're classic risks where the client government side needs to think much harder about, really, do we want to try and sheet those home? Because normally all they do is boomerang back to government anyway in time and cost. That's just been the reality of a lot of projects. So I think risk allocation is getting more sophisticated. I think there are far better tools that people should be using though on both sides of that partnership, where it's data-driven, industry collaboration in terms of actually how we share information as best we can, including governments across jurisdictions. Annabel and I were just talking about the ability to do a wonderful job on a project in Brisbane and transport that thinking and contracting to Perth or Sydney or Melbourne. Never really happens. We talk about it, we have sort of one-on-one bilateral discussions, but systemically we don't do that enough in governments collectively and actually be grown up enough to say, that was a perfect contracting model. We're lifting and shifting it to another jurisdiction and deploying that. And constructors saying, yes, it is a really good contracting model. Conversely, saying one that's not good, not doing too much more of it, where the risk is just attempted to be sheeted home to the private sector and they can't bear it. So a lot more industry collaboration, and I'm not naive enough to say that they're all going to hand over their commercial information to each other, but there are certain things where we could go a lot deeper than we are now.
Yeah, Annabel.
And I think there's some really great examples of where it's worked. So if you look at the level crossing removal projects that have been going for about 5 years, 5 different contractors working collaboratively to share ideas. And I think the ingredient to success is, number one, that's an alliance. So you're all at the top table with the client and the service providers creating outcomes. But also they're looking at things like capability, and you've got a team on the client that's very experienced, as well as the contractors. So they're working together, but then the culture piece. So that really looks at behaviours across all of those alliances. So I think those 3 ingredients, the contract's essential, but also the capability of the teams and the culture that you're trying to develop to keep it moving.
Seved?
Yeah, for sure, we try to avoid compromising on contracts which can be financially harmful to our supply chain and people, because it's not sustainable on the long term. So I guess as contractors, we all try to not engage in this type of difficult relationship contracts. That's important. Like you said, Kerry, I mean, there are risks that we are meant to manage, you know, productivity and methods and design, but rise and fall, escalation, for instance, we'd like to not be judged or assessed on that when we tender jobs, because inflation, who knows, we can't compete on that. But I think it's healthy for the industry to compete on what we're made for, like productivity and what we built, because we have to be we have to deliver value for money, and we have to be to remain competitive.
There's an issue, I think, that sits within this that Kerry sort of spoke to with her example of a really complex project where there's a dynamic aspect to risk. And I think sitting beneath some of the questions that are coming through and how we think about risk sharing is that you sort of start a project and you have a sense of what the risks are, and then you sit down and you divvy them up and say, well, you have that risk and I'll have this risk. I'm interested in understanding, you know, how the maturity, if you like, of those arrangements are evolving to reflect that you don't know what the risks are, and how you get into a genuine collaborative sort of relationship, if you like, where there's trust in how you understand those risks and the project, and how you then evolve your thinking about where they sit and how they're managed. Anyone want to dive into that?
Look, I think Victoria has actually led the way in this area. So, the North East Link project, they've really looked at ways to contract that allows some flexibility, so acknowledging that some of the areas of the past you can't predict what those risks are, so they're being a bit flexible about areas that are unknown or unquantifiable, having them dealt with on an open book basis, even in a PPP structure. For other projects that are very complex, they're entering into alliances so that they've got the flexibility to make those decisions as you move on. So I think there's, and look, I think Victoria's leading in this space. Other states are probably a bit behind. So I think that structure engenders a commitment to work together and solve the problems, because some of these jobs are running 5-6 years, so absolutely impossible to predict COVID escalation, because it's really a gamble. So I think there is some positive example. Yeah.
Chip in. So I remember sort of in government, people would sort of say about each mega project procurement, what's the perfect contracting structure? And my response was always the same: I'll let you know in about 15 years' time, because we tried absolutely everything. Every sort of style of contract known is, you know, procured in most jurisdictions, but certainly in Victoria and New South Wales. And none of them are perfect. Some of them are better than others, but none of them are perfect. The point that Annabel's raising, I actually completely concur with. We've had in New South Wales some rigidity in certain project structures and contract structures where, in hindsight, the issues are manifested anyway in cost and time, and I know who paid for it in the end as well. But so that flexibility, and to go to another level of detail, partnering between, even within a consortium or with the government agency, just thinking about scope and being a little bit more flexible on scope and sub-components of that scope, and on the interface risks, on the interfaces themselves and who bears the risk. And that's not to be naive and sort of commercially soft about it. It's not at all. It's actually to be a grown-up, to the points that Annabel was raising, having some target cost models for certain components where you just don't have a clue. Even though you've sat down 5 years before and said, we can get real certainty on that, well, it hasn't proven to be true. And the last thing I'd say on that then is just in managing the risks on the way through, there's just so much data-driven process that you can put in place now. Old Excel spreadsheet, tick box and forget about risk management. At this scale, we've got a long way to move there, I think, in taking governance, risk and assurance far more seriously on both sides of that partnership.
Kerry, you were chortling as Tim started speaking. Did you have some thoughts on this as well?
No, I was absolutely agreeing with what he was saying, but Annabel just mentioned COVID too, which is giving us an absolute example of things that were not expected and not thought of in any contract written, but which has had profound impacts on the contracts that were started pre-COVID and then are still, they're big projects, some of them are still going on. And what happened with COVID, as you will all recall, you couldn't move people across state borders. You couldn't get any supply chain material from offshore. You couldn't get the technical experts you needed from offshore. And the contract said you were supposed to be finished at X, whatever time that was, and it was supposed to only cost Y. And a lot of contracts hadn't taken that into account. And so then we sit here and wonder why some contractors are going broke. I mean, it's not rocket science to look at the sort of time delay and the costs that have been incurred through what has been a mammoth upheaval. But it's a really classic example of something, a couple of things that weren't taken into account, and you really couldn't have expected it.
Question from the audience. It's rocketed up the charts in terms of votes. So, and it goes like this. Quite simply, what risk should government always underwrite for complex long-term projects? Is there an answer, and who wants to go first?
I think contractors might want to answer that one first.
For me, I'd say it's generally unquantifiable risk. And it's not necessarily underwrite, so contractors are open to sharing the risk or having models where it's transparent. So it's not that we're looking to have a windfall gain, it's about how do you manage it. So escalation at the moment would be a good example that from an ACA industry perspective, it is really killing many of the contractors, and I think Equifax came out with a report from this year that a third of contractors have been downgraded to a credit watch rating, which is crazy. So I think that'd be the number one for me.
I actually agree with that.
I can only agree. I mean, for me, escalation is one. Yes. And also, again, asking us to compete at tender stage on escalation, I mean, which phase can the client or the government have on the tender we put when we say escalation is going to be X on a 6 or 7 years long contract? So I think there is a real value for the government to ask all the clients to ask us to compete on what we can really compete on, and the escalation can go up or down, and keep that aside. I think there is a real value in that in terms of managing the outturn cost for the customer.
I think the other major risk that governments probably should take, not all of, but most of, is community liaison and dealing with not all the planning approvals, but the parts of it that dealing with communities. Not all of that, it's a joint risk in some ways, but many of it is government risk also, best carried by the public sector.
I completely agree. I mean, the social licence for the project is with the government agency and political level, and yes, the contractor has to be a very good corporate citizen in the area that they're working and do all the right things on safety and noise and every other environmental impact and meet their moral contract with the community. But overarching, I see that as a government role to lead and lead well.
So I'm going to try to join those two comments to a question that we've got here, which is around where stakeholders represent a risk. Where do they represent an opportunity in major project development, and what are the effective strategies that you've seen to manage this? And I think what I'm hearing from Kerry and Tim is that the best way to manage stakeholder risk is through the government owning that risk. Am I leading the witness here, or? You've
led the witness, but correctly. Absolutely. I mean, I really think that, having seen so many projects where certain third-party agreements are sheeted home to the contractor, and it's almost you're handcuffing yourself, because then you're hoping that they can get on with that third-party agreement. Government should just take those things on themselves, in my experience. There's some pretty ordinary things you have to do around a project. Yes, the contractor has to have their moral contract and social licence with the community, but at the end of the day, your client and the 20 third parties that you might have to deal with, the government has a pretty strong role to play. I don't necessarily mean getting down into the weeds quite literally, or the utilities or the contamination. Yes, the contractor takes those things on. You might share some of that risk because of unknowns, but broadly around the project, that's for the government agency to run
Annabel,
with.
you're nodding.
And I just think there's the concept of who takes the risk. I think there's certainly ones government should keep. But I think the best outcomes are where it's the government and contractors and all of those third parties collaborating really early to understand it and working together, because the contractors bring a different perspective than government, and so the power of those groups working together as early as possible, and there's models that facilitate that, I think give you the right outcomes. But and utilities risk, contamination risk, we can manage a lot of those knowns. It's just the unknown that we can't.
I think you've answered this question, but I've got to put it here because the audience wants a direct answer. And I'm going to ask each one of you if that's all right. Are fixed price contracts sensible for complex projects?
I'm happy to go first. No, I don't think so.
Annabel?
Not for really complex engineered projects.
Seved?
We just said, okay, putting aside the escalation, but otherwise I think it's still doable, I would say. For instance, I give you an example. We, with our joint venture partners, we opened to traffic the West Connex 3A in Sydney in January. Technically, in terms of program, budget, client, people, it's a very good success. We opened 3 months earlier than the original contract date. So having gone through COVID and taking Kerry's comment earlier, so with the right attitude of finding solutions to mitigate delays and so on from the client and the contractor, we can still go through a COVID period and still finish earlier. And this is a good example. At the end, you've got client happy, stakeholders happy, and people on the project happy. And this synergy between client, stakeholder, and people is super important, because happy people on projects, the productivity is better and the outcome is better. So I think that's an example of a fixed price contract that can be successful. It depends on the environment, and so I wouldn't say this is a rule, but it's still doable.
Kerry, any views?
I think that's probably quite a good example, but it's always, even in a project like West Connex in Sydney, it might be fixed price, but it's always subject to X, Y, and Z that are outside the fixed price, that that there will be adjustments for and understandings about as you go. The thing around fixed price that I would say is that we need to persuade politicians not to announce what the price is when they're announcing the wonderful project that they're about to do, because it ends up being you will end up going over whatever it was that was announced, and you will probably end up being late, and everybody will get into trouble. And I can't tell you how many times I've tried to persuade politicians not to announce the first estimated price, but I have failed many times.
Just to be really clear, you want someone to go out and announce a big project but not put the billions of dollars next to it?
Well, certainly put a rather large range around it. Definitely do not put one price on it, particularly for all the complex projects that are going on now.
But in terms of that, like, lessons learnt over the last 5 years in particular, we've moved from, here's the number, to a range, to a broader range. They've still been wrong, but look, I completely agree with Kerry. The political and media imperative to actually get out there and say a number is pretty stark and pointed, but it proves to be wrong anyway. So
we should go to not less than, not less than $10 billion.
Budget estimates for that type of response from the guy. I like it. But it does need to continue evolving. Media, community, political level have to understand that where we start is not where we're going to end. It's as simple as that. And the reality of the last 10 years has proved that around the country, basically.
Question here, with the trend for major projects to be delivered on more collaborative reimbursable cost models, which promote quality and safety, is there an argument to continue with projects delivered via PPPs?
I'm happy to have a go at that. I think there is an argument to do that, and I'm very aware that at the moment the flavour is a bit anti-PPPs, but they do have a role to play, particularly on where the design and the engineering is really quite untried and unknown in Australia, and we're importing expertise and particular engineering techniques that we haven't used before, and I think they work quite well in that sort of capacity. And I think there's lots of PPP projects around that have worked very well. What we need to try to avoid, though, is where the amount of money that the public sector is trying to put in is almost de minimis. It should be a partnership. So, you know, if it's not a sort of 50-50 type split, you know, you're in a different sort of world.
I think the form of PPPs, as Kerry said, that they're morphing and people are learning as they go, so it depends what's in it. So if you de-risk some components that are delivered outside the PPP, major civils, tunnelling, whatever, the PPP becomes an operating franchise plus line-wide and a whole range of other things, and you know, that helps. But what I said before about thinking about the subcomponents of scope and where they might land and not land helps, but there just needs to be a bit more flexibility in there, not necessarily fully to alliance, but something has to give in there, because the rigidity of them, you know, in Kerry and my experience has meant that, you know, you just can't sheet home all of that risk because of too many unknowns, and the unpicking of the arrangement then is pretty tricky.
Yeah. Annabel and Seved, there's a question here around if we're moving, that I will sort of translate as if you're moving past cost as the main basis for awarding contracts, and you're looking at the broader value proposition, if you like, and as far as sort of talked about the different ways that they're thinking about this, you know, what are some of the metrics that you are thinking about or you'd like to see, or that sort of go to broader performance? How would you like to be measured on that?
Look, I think there's a whole range of things. So social procurement, social values, sustainability goals, I think primarily performance and the people. I mean, we see examples in the market now where contractors aren't performing, that they're continuing to win projects. So I think there should be a real value put on past performance as well as current performance. And then I think one of the really key aspects is how do you promote and support innovation and productivity. So I think one of the earlier panels talked about, we're just chasing our tails on our thin margins, and we never really have the time to stop and pause and innovate. So if clients genuinely were picking us on our ability to innovate and change and bring in build a digital model, then build it physically, I think that would really encourage us to invest. But at the moment, it's asked for, but it's not valued. So I think some of those measures and those outcomes would be helpful. Seved?
Yes, indeed, it's usually on tenders nowadays we are asked to innovate, we are asked what's our strategy in terms of decarbonization, but there is no rule to assess the tender on this criteria. So I think decarbonization is fairly new, I think, for everyone. So in some countries, some governments are doing some experimental assessment rules. And I think here, Victoria, for instance, is the Victorian government. What I heard is that they're very keen to implement some assessment rules very soon for decarbonization. I think this is very, very welcome, because if it is part of the tender rule that we've got to be carbon efficient and not relying on carbon offsets credits, but the absolute value of our carbon emission. Then we are pushed. We have no alternative. We have to do it, and then the entire supply chain is motivated and to produce solutions and to work out solutions. And in fact, from the ultimate client to us and the supply chain, if it comes from the client, it's very powerful. So for us, at the moment, we are, each contractor during the bidding phase, work out solutions and so on, but there is no real push to the supply chain. There is no real obligation to develop low carbon concretes or whatever. So I think we have a common interest to come to that point very quickly on big tenders.
Kerry, I want to ask you a specific question if I could, and unfortunately the other three I probably aren't going to have insights on this one, but it goes to the report that you've done on inland rail, which the Minister described as gripping reading. So well done. I know you probably don't want to go into any of the specifics, it hasn't been released yet, but are there some high-level messages that you think are relevant for the audience in terms of lessons learned?
There are so many lessons actually to be learned from that project that I'm hesitant to pick out one, but it really is a very large and complex project, because one of the lessons is we forget how big Australia is, and that project is actually building a railway line from London to the Ukraine border. That's how long it is. And we sort of forget, because we just think, oh, we're going from Melbourne to Brisbane, and that's sort of not a big problem. And it's sort of not, but this is a big project. And it means that it's going across a number of different states, all of whom have different planning approvals, different environmental approvals. You're going through a squillion number of different First Nation countries, huge number of regional towns, interoperability that was mentioned this morning around rail systems, very important, etc., etc. So not an easy project, and I think one of the main lessons from it is to just get the beginnings and preparations done fairly carefully, particularly for a big project like that. The engineering on most of it is not terribly complicated, though it is in some places, but the actual delivery really is quite challenging, both because of the distance, but also because of the half of that railway line is being used at the moment and has to continue to be used. So people were talking about the difficulties of working with possessions, that you don't get possessions very often, so you're quite limited in when you can do it, and then on top of everything else you had COVID and you couldn't move people around, and et cetera, et cetera. So but there are a lot of lessons learned, particularly I think around preparation and also the governance of the project, which is a sort of really a lesson for government more than anything else.
We've got time for one more question but I'm going to sneak it in and know that you're standing between lunch and the audience, or the audience and lunch, however you'd like to think about that. But the question that's come through here, which I think sort of summarises what we've been talking about, is, basically how do you create the best space possible for collaboration on the big projects? Tim?
I think it starts with culture, behaviour, spirit of partnership, and actually how the government client actually presents itself. It can be adversarial from day dot, or it can be quite collaborative and really listen. So all the innovation that was just spoken about there, about green concrete and all the rest of it, governments will want that ultimately. It'll go into procurement. There is probably a need for stronger push from the construction industry itself to help place those things appropriately into the procurement guidance. That's completely fine. It should be an interactive process, but it starts with culture, behaviour and a spirit of partnership, and it should stay there for the entire time of the project.
Annabel?
I think that one sort of simple and unsexy sort of answer would be just slow down at the beginning and spend a bit more time planning together before you get into action. We're hopeless at that as contractors, but I think if we all held ourselves back, got clear about what our motivation was and slowed down, we'd do better.
It seems so simple, doesn't it? Like anyone who's involved in major projects, it's like everyone's like, if you don't nail the scope at the beginning, your project is never going to succeed. But it's a good reminder, so go slow at the beginning. Seved?
Yes, indeed. About technical solution, value engineering and program, it's important to make a pause at the beginning and make the right decisions, because they will dictate the success of the project on the long term. For sure. And once key decision planning is agreed, then time is of the essence. So in terms of collaboration, if all parties involved, I mean, client, contractors, supply chain, are aware of the timing and the key decision timing that has been agreed, I mean, and everyone works to that. It's super important, because helping you is helping me type of attitude, and achieving the dates. Because when we start drifting on the program, then everyone will bleed. I mean, starting with the contractor, and then at the end of the day, it is going to be the client problem as well. So it's important to have this attitude of problem solving, so that the project can be on time.
Kerry, final word?
Oh, no, I absolutely agree with that. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much to each of our panellists. Can you join me in thanking them?